All right, so I wanted to talk about Chelsea Kryst, the former Miss USA that tragically passed away yesterday. And I've been seeing a lot of the usual people talk about mental health, suicide, um, the normal things that people will talk about after something like this. And I do have personal experience with feeling that way myself. I've had depression, I've had suicidal idealizations. So I'm not coming at this from an angle of I have no idea what I'm talking about. I've been there. But I think there's a lot of different angles we got to take to really address this properly. And first and foremost, I believe that anyone who's struggling with any sort of mental health issue or addiction issue, it's always our own responsibility first, nobody else's, for us to do something about our issue. That is always true. And it's hard to help people sometimes that don't want to help themselves. So I'm big into making people, like, holding someone accountable and saying, hey, if we're feeling depressed, and don't get it twisted, I don't think passing away like that, it doesn't always have to do with mental illness. Sometimes it could be like a psychosis, or there could be lots of trauma. But for whatever the reasons it occurs, like, I do believe it doesn't end the pain. It only transfers it to somebody else. And when someone decides to do that, what happens is no more earthly possibilities are available. Like, that's it. That happens to someone. You do that, and then the pain gets transferred to somebody else, and there's no more hope, because ultimately it is an act of, like, a no hope. People do not think it can get better when they're in that state. But one of the things I believe is depression in particular. If we are feeling depressed, it usually means we should be trying something different. And maybe that means going on medicine. Maybe that means taking supplements. Maybe it means changing our routine, changing our careers, changing our relationships, changing the people around us, better sleep, diet, and exercise. But whatever it is, if we're feeling that way, it's an indicator that we need to be doing something different. And I think that is true too. And we never know when we're going to find the things that actually help us. Sometimes we don't know. Chelsea Kryst was 30 years old when she jumped off the 29th story. And obviously a very attractive woman. She didn't have a husband or a boyfriend, but easily she could have attracted one, no doubt. I'm not sure if she wanted kids or anything like that, but people were sharing their thoughts about it. And they were going through her Instagram. She did an interview with Denzel Washington a couple weeks ago, and no one knew. No one knew anything was going on with her. No one knew that she was depressed. No one knew that there was something underneath there going on. And why is that? It's because she didn't want to tell anyone for whatever reason. Now, maybe she didn't have people in her life that made her feel comfortable enough to talk about it. That's possibly true, but it's not necessarily their responsibility. Now, I'm seeing people share things like, we got to be more sensitive to what everyone's going through. We need to treat people well. We need to get rid of the pain as a taboo thing. And, I agree. I agree that we all should be trying our best to be there for others, tell them we love them, etc. And I don't really think pain is a taboo topic anymore. I think, if anything, it's more commonplace now than ever. It's more acceptable than ever to talk about mental health and talk about depression and mental health awareness, suicide awareness. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's there. But it comes down to the individual. If they don't want to do something different, if they do not want to talk about it, doesn't really matter what other people around them are going to say and do if they're not willing to do something about the issue. Bottom line. So I think it starts there. And that might even ruffle some people's feathers, me saying that, but ultimately it's true. It's true that we got to take care of our issues. It's true that if we're feeling that way, it's an indicator we should be doing something different. I think that's also true. I think it's true that it doesn't end the pain, it only transfers it to somebody else. And I hear a lot of people, when I say something like that, say, oh, it's selfish of the other person to want to make the person in pain have to live. It's selfish of them. And it's like, oh, that's about your happiness and not theirs. And I really don't buy that take at all. I do not buy that take because, first of all, it's about trying to help the person like with the issue. Right now, there's something going on where there is a lot of acceptance going on of mental health issues. There is a lot of tolerance, but what works for one person may not work for the next person. I believe whatever works for somebody, that's what I'm for. I do not really care what works for somebody. I don't care if it's prescription drugs or supplements or religion or yoga, meditation, or whatever it is. I don't care as long as it's producing good results in your life. And I don't buy that, oh, it's selfish to make someone want to live in pain because you never know. You never know what could have helped her. Like, for all she knew, 6 months from now, something could have been completely different. She could have found something that could have been life changing for her. But when you do that, all those possibilities go out the window. And that's why, because let's face it, when someone does that, sometimes they may think, oh, the world will be better off without me. But usually, unless you're Hitler or something, what you're really doing is you're depriving the world of the gifts that you would have to offer down the road. So think of all the people that someone could help, that and themselves too. It's not just about helping others, it's about the great things they could do in their own lives too. Like, those are all the things that will be erased from existence. They will no longer be given a chance to work, to be there. And it's a, that's a tragedy. So maybe she could have grown, she could have had kids, but now those kids will never be born. Think of all the things and people she could have helped and done, but now they're no longer going to happen either. So I just don't like that argument when they say, oh, you don't know how she was feeling, so how could you ever say that? And it's like, well, yeah, the feelings are not fact, though. Feelings are often temporary and they come and go. And when we do something like that, that is the permanent solution. It certainly is. And I don't like people limiting their possibilities. Like, things can get better if we're going to try to do something different and we keep on going and we don't give up. Like, I know some people will say I'm being hard on them, but there's a difference. I think there's a lot of women, they're going to help from more of a feminine angle, more of the emoting and feeling angle. And, that's completely fine. But I think part of the masculine angle is being more logical and pragmatic about it. Like, I want to see you get better. I want to see you get past it and go over it. That's what I want to see. And how does that happen? It's going to be different for everybody. It's not going to be the same for everybody. Some people, there's a place for the acceptance. There's a place for the tolerance. But there's also a place for a little kind of kick in the ass too, because the choices people make absolutely make a huge difference. So someone struggling with mental health, for example, but they're constantly making the decision to, say, drink, which they know aggravates their mental health. I don't think too much acceptance and tolerance of their drinking is really going to be too helpful for them. Sometimes you need the person to say, hey, you need to cut that shit out because it's hurting you and you know it. And so that's where I think acceptance and tolerance, they have their limitations in actually getting things done. I'm not going to say, oh no, you're a terrible person for ever drinking or ever feeling that way. No, not at all. There's a place where you want to let people feel comfortable and open so they feel safe around you, and being safe telling the truth in particular, because that's another big one. A lot of people who struggle, there's only certain people they feel comfortable, if anyone, that actually feel comfortable being honest with. And why is that? Often because they don't want to hear the feedback or whatever else they think the other person is going to say. Now, and that's an issue for both sides, though. So if a person is struggling and they're super depressed or they've had a lot of trauma or whatever, and they're feeling that way, and they know the people in their lives currently aren't necessarily tons of people that you can talk about that kind of stuff with, then it's up to them to try to find a new circle. It's up to them to reach out for help. It's up for them to do something different, like I said. And so that's why I think There's the place for the acceptance and the tolerance, but I also sometimes think it allows people to stay stuck. And when you see someone staying stuck, if you really care and love them, you stop with the tolerance and acceptance, and you get a little tougher about it and say, "Hey, I really care about you, and I want to see you do better. And so I'm not going to just sit by and co-sign your BS." That's something they say a lot in NA and AA. Don't co-sign other people's BS. When you really care about them, you don't do that. And that's like a great thing about AA and NA for people. It's a community of people that there's a lot of people they can talk to in that community. And now, of course, their common issue is alcohol and AA and drugs and NA, but that community piece, being like okay, telling others the truth and telling them their deepest, darkest secrets, that's powerful stuff, man. And I've heard some dark, dark, dark stuff when I used to go there. And it really opens your eyes. And it kind of makes you also think, oh, okay, I'm not quite as terrible as I once thought I was, because there's all these other things going on too. And it's not supposed to be a comparison, but when you see someone open up and have the courage to share some dark stuff, like that's pretty admirable to me. And so I have a different mindset when it comes to that kind of thing for a lot of people. But some people don't have that kind of community though. So she was a former Miss USA. And for people that have been successful and they've never kind of gone off the rails like I have, I think sometimes it can be harder for them. It can be harder for them because people, they don't, what's the word? They don't want to let other people down. They don't want to share that they're struggling because they are afraid how other people will then see them. Like, oh, this person they're the person that's always smiling and happy. They don't want to be the quote unquote negative person or the unhappy person. And it's like, no, it's not really that way. And if those are the kind of things that your friends would really say to you, not necessarily that good either. So, but I recognize what might help women is going to be a little different than one that could help men in some cases. But either way, I'm for an individual approach to everyone. So I want to give a little acceptance, a little tolerance, but I don't want to co-sign any BS. I don't want to help people to stay stuck, because if something's continuing to stay the same, it's like they always say, if nothing changes, nothing changes. And so I'd encourage people, you got to do something different. You got to do something different. And ultimately also, what helped me out of those kind of things was I kept on doing different things. I developed more goals for myself. I developed a good supplement routine. And that part, there certainly was a scientific component in me, whether it was hormonal or neurotransmitters, etc. Whatever it was, it made a night and day difference. I've made a lot of videos about supplements because they've been super important for me. Because, I don't know, maybe I had a lot of different issues going on, like an Asperger type issue, severe anxiety, like CPTSD or other trauma related stuff. It's tough. Like, it's not going to be easy, but sometimes we need that extra help of, okay, we got to get our neurotransmitters taken care of here a little bit. And that's a huge thing. It's not something to be taken lightly. But also, besides that, like a mindset is key. And then sleep, diet, exercise is very key too. Those are all things that have helped me. And it's like I said, it's not easy to do any of it, but it's certainly necessary if we want to be better. If we want to get better, it's certainly necessary. So, like, those are all the things that really helped me to get out of it. And, I also think I was a little lucky too. And ultimately, though, and this is one of the things that stopped me, the suicide doesn't end the pain thing. It only transfers it to somebody else. That part stopped me. And also, this is another thing I couldn't square. But if we're grateful to be alive, if we're grateful for our life, and the things we have in our lives, how could we possibly do it? If we're truly grateful, how could we do that? And the answer I came up with was, you can't. You can't do it if you're truly grateful, because there's something going on there. And part of it is maybe mental illness. Part of it's certainly trauma. I'm reading a book right now called The Body Keeps the Score. And the holistic psychologist, she mentioned it in her book, How to Do the Work. And as I'm reading it, it's about a psychiatrist that he's talking about his experiences in the beginning of treating Vietnam vets with PTSD, treating World War II vets with PTSD. And he said there was like a few different components. There was the component of what they saw in wartime. And he goes into graphic detail about what they saw. Then he goes into what they did, because often once the initial trauma occurred, then there was trauma responses and the crazy things that the soldiers did. And then having to come back to the real world and trying to be a husband and a father, and how they didn't have feeling anymore. Like they just felt empty and they couldn't show love. They couldn't feel love and they were just full of trauma. Now, I haven't read the whole book yet, but from that description, it fits a lot of people. It fits a lot of people that have probably had BPD, CPTSD, even narcissistic personality disorder, bipolar disorder, depression, people struggling with addiction. I mean, let's face it, one of the biggest triggers for addiction is some form of trauma or another, whether it's sexual molestations or beatings or seeing your parents beat one another. There's all sorts of things that happen. And that's not even in a war zone. And then a war zone adds a whole other element. But that trauma stuff, it's tough. And there's ways to try to push through it. But one of the things I also believe is you do got to feel it to heal it a little bit. And having goals and things to aim for, that's another big one. And those, like, every little thing helps. That's the thing. It's not going to be just one thing. Oh, you do this one thing and you're good. It's like you get on this one medicine and everything's better. It's like, no, that's true for nothing. They're all pieces. They're all components that fit together that add up to the whole. Now, like I shared before, I've had those kind of feelings before myself, and it was pretty dark. And I fully admit when I felt that way, it was the hardest at that time to do what was good for me. Because when I wasn't feeling it, when I was feeling in a dark place, the last thing I wanted to do were things that were good for me. But it was when I needed to do the most of all, when I felt that way. And that's why, again, why I say the acceptance and tolerance thing isn't always good. So you hear someone say, I don't want to get out of bed because I'm super depressed today. And maybe someone full of acceptance and tolerance would say, oh, that's fine, take that day. But if it keeps on continuing, sometimes I think the right thing to do with them would be like, no, you're coming out with me, let's go. And not tolerate it. And again, this is the other person's responsibility too. The person who's feeling this way, it is their responsibility. Ultimately, it's their responsibility. But it doesn't mean we can't try our best to help others too. It doesn't mean that like we see our friends down and the people we love down. It doesn't mean that we're just going to turn our backs on them. It's like, no, we're going to try to help them. There was a saying in NA where they would say, sometimes you blow life into your buddy, and sometimes that very same person blows life back into you because you need it at separate times, right? And they say in that program where, oh, sometimes, you go insane and you never feel your sanity leaving, but you do feel its return. And when you're feeling in that insane state or psychotic state, that's when it's great to have a community of people around you that you can be honest with. Like if I had to say one thing to help someone who's feeling that way right now, it's to get some people in your life that you can share everything with. And usually it's not best if this is a romantic person. Usually it's best if it's more of a friendship. But you get a person that you can share anything with, your deepest, darkest stuff. And you can be honest with one another, and you can hold each other accountable. If I had to say one thing, that's the number one thing, is to get that. And then you got to figure out, okay, is this some sort of mental illness? Am I like a clinically depressed person? Do I have an anxiety disorder? Because that's another realm of it. Maybe you do need some medicine. Maybe you do need to try supplements. And I would always say, I recommend trying supplements first. Because I do think the earth has given us a lot of things that are beneficial for us. And in my opinion, the prescription meds are the last resort. You go to that last because they're the most powerful. I prefer to try to see the supplement side work first. And I've been lucky enough to find supplements that work. I'm not on any prescription medicine, so I'm pretty grateful for that. But if prescription meds are what someone finds and it helps them, awesome. I think that's great too. Like I said, I don't care what works for people as long as it works. And I'll say this, when someone goes do that, whether they're Anthony Bourdain or Chris Cornell or this woman, Chelsea Kryst, from the other day, it's like when that happens, I don't think it means what they were doing was working. I don't think it means that. I think it means that, it's kind of like it's the permanent solution, kind of like giving up a little bit. And I get it. I've had those experiences too, where that seems like a great idea. And we can convince ourselves that things would be better without us. It'd be great if we were gone. But that's not, that's what I think it's so important to have like a faith in something. People that we can talk to, that's another big one, but have like things and write them down. Like a grateful person, by definition, couldn't do that. That's one thing. Think of all the things that you would never be able to do if you did. Think of all the people that you might hurt. Now they say, "Oh, don't be guilt shaming the person. Don't guilt shame the person." But it's like often, like, and you hear stories about this sometimes of someone that was going to like failed attempts where they try and then it doesn't work, but then later they become super grateful that it didn't work. Or someone who tried to jump off a bridge and the second they let go, they have instant regret. And it's like, yeah, I get the feeling. I certainly get it. But I'd always say, wait one more day. Wait one more day. And I think Chelsea Kryst, in her last Instagram post, she said something haunting. It said, may today be the day you find peace, or something along those lines. And, when someone starts talking like that, if you know they've been depressed, sometimes that can mean they're feeling good because they've stopped fighting it in their minds and they've made the decision to do it and they get relieved. But it seems to me that in her scenario, I don't know if she was seeing any therapists, psychiatrists, or whatever, but it seems to me there was a lot of steps like in between, like where she just didn't talk about it. She didn't have people to talk to about it. And so it seemed like it was coming out of nowhere. And then all of a sudden, boom, it's gone. But hopefully there's a lot of steps before that happens. But if you're someone like her, and if you're feeling this way right now, like I said, it's your responsibility first to do something about it. It's not going to be, doesn't mean other people won't be there for you. Doesn't mean they can't help you. But ultimately, the work will be done by you. And it's great to have good friends. It's great to have them by your side and to hold you accountable and to give you some acceptance and tolerance when necessary. But ultimately, it's on you. So do something about the issue. If nothing changes, nothing changes. And if we're feeling terrible, whether it's from trauma, depression, mental illness, or even some temporary psychosis or whatever it may be, if we're feeling those things, it means we got to try something different. And there's ways to do that. Like I try to help people with that when it comes to practicing radical self-respect. But I'm a coach. So I'm not a licensed professional counselor. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a LCSW, licensed clinical social worker. But again, I don't care who people go to see, as long as it helps them, and as long as it's producing positive results. That's it. So I kind of wanted to talk about that today because it seemed like a good time after what happened yesterday to get some of my thoughts out there about it. And like again, don't be afraid to talk about it if you're someone out there feeling that way. Now do something different. Find some people out there in your life that you can be open and honest with. It's more accepting now than ever right now. Like there's not nearly as much stigma as there used to be. Mental health awareness is a big thing. Suicide awareness is a big thing. So don't feel guilty about it. Happens to the best of us, really. A lot of us have had trauma. A lot of us has had severe mood disorder type issues. It's nothing to be ashamed of. But to me, the only thing to be ashamed of would be to not do anything about the issue. But we got a comment here. I want to see what it says. So, hey brother, I have a question. What are your thoughts on Andrew Tate's view on depression and suicide? So, I did actually make a video about this. And so for those of you who don't know, Andrew Tate says that depression isn't real. Now, ultimately, I don't agree with him that depression isn't real, but I do agree with kind of a lot of things he says after that. And he says the feeling of depression's real. And then he also goes on to say what I said earlier, that it means that we got to try something different. Now, Andrew Tate's whole thing, it's awakening the masculine side of men's brains. It's about extreme ownership, getting shit done, and kind of like the kick you in the ass approach. And I said earlier also, I'm for anything that could possibly help people. And if you look at the comments on the videos where he has said that, whether it be on Fresh and Fit or on his own show, there's a lot of dudes that were depressed at one point that really appreciated his message and said, you know what, Andrew? That was the kick in the ass I needed to do better. Thank you so much. And to me, that means it was good. His message was good because it helped a bunch of people. However, there's going to be other people out there that feel gaslit by Andrew's message. They'll think, I know depression's real, and here he is saying depression isn't real, and they feel like it's abuse, it's gaslighting to them. And if you're one of those people, I would say, you know what? You don't need to care what Andrew Tate thinks. If the message doesn't apply to you, the message doesn't apply to you. Now, they could also say, well, I don't want the other person, the next person down the line who's depressed to be gaslit either. And it's like, okay, all right. But we can't control what anyone else thinks. I do think his message helps men. I think it helps a certain kind of men. And that the fact that he does that, that is great. And like his approach is certainly not the purely acceptance and tolerance approach. Absolutely not. It's the kick you in the ass approach. Like something along the lines of if you're a millionaire and you have a hot 19-year-old every day, you're not going to be depressed. Now, I get that too. Like, there's a little truth in that. But ultimately, though, internally, right, there's not going to be an external solution to internal problems often. And I've heard a stat one time that said like a huge majority of entrepreneurs are actually suffering from some form of undiagnosed mental illness. And it's often because they're trying to compensate, right? They're trying to compensate externally for a lack that they feel on the inside. I have a little bit of that myself, I believe. But I don't think it's all bad. I think sometimes part of healing and doing what works for us is kind of working with the cards we've been dealt. So if we've had trauma, we know that, okay, we've had some experiences that make us want to overachieve. Is that really the worst thing? Is it really the worst thing to want to overachieve and do better? I don't think it is. I think that that's part of how we incorporate it into our lives. We get better and we work with it. Doesn't mean we go too far. It doesn't mean we just run ourselves into the ground and not take care of ourselves, but I like myself. And if you like yourself and you love yourself, you kind of got to be grateful for all the things that made you who you are today. I think that's also true. It doesn't mean like, and especially if you're a parent and you lost a child or something, of course you're not going to be grateful that happened. But perhaps you could be grateful for like the people you've been able to help since that has happened or something along those lines. So another question here. In my opinion, we as men lost so much of quote unquote men holding other men accountable that we need that kind of love sometimes. Absolutely agree. I do think we got to hold each other accountable. Sometimes you can't co-sign other people's BS, right? So if you see them doing poorly in their lives, you see them doing things they shouldn't be doing. And this is something Andrew Tate says also that his brother Tristan does for him. He said, like, if Andrew said if he was getting fat, his brother Tristan would say, dude, what the hell are you doing? You used to be a G. You used to be the 4-time kickboxing champion. Now here you are fat. Like, get to it. Like, do better. No excuses. And I think that's great. And that's like what I was saying before. That's why I think there's limitations to the acceptance and tolerance stuff, especially for men. Now, women, they need a little more acceptance and tolerance. That's fine. I don't care what works for people as long as it works. But there's a lot of men that they need that. They need that kick. They need that, like, no, man. And that's how men can be. Men can be competitive. Men can be like really driven and mission oriented. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that's why I get so discouraged when I see people like Lewis Howes talk about the truth about masculinity, or whatever the heck the name of that book was, where it seems like a lot of the book is really, you need to be more like women. You need to emote more like women and act like that. It's like, is that really what you need? Is that really what you need? Maybe, like, and don't get it twisted, right? Men and women both, we have masculine and feminine parts of ourselves. No one's 100% one or the other. It doesn't mean we should suppress the feminine side either. But if we're going to be masculine, you got to be masculine. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. And I think men can help men in a way that other women can't help men. I don't even think that's too debatable at this point. That's another reason why they say in those fellowships, men should stick with the men and women should stick with the women. Because, let's face it, women don't have experience with male problems from being a male, right? And women doesn't know anything about the dating stuff unless they've been a lesbian. So Lewis has another question here. Let's see. No. Oh. Since you touched on the emoting like women thing, can I ask you another question about emotional control being a fundamental trait of masculinity? Yeah, I do think it's a fundamental trait of masculinity. Not to be confused with suppressing. Doesn't mean like, oh, don't feel it. It doesn't mean stuff it so that it blows up later. But part of courage to me is doing the right thing regardless of how we feel. And sometimes that means feeling something and being able to take a step back and being able to act more reasonably and logically and rationally. I think that's a huge thing. And that's why I don't agree with the always needing to emote part, because it's not always best to just act on our feelings. It's not always the appropriate course of action. And a lot of times it's the wrong course of action and puts us in more trouble. So I have no problems with someone saying something like, you know what? They feel something. Okay, let me sleep on this. Let me sleep on this and get back to you. And this goes right hand in hand with not having like really emotional arguments. Sometimes that doesn't help either. Letting all your emotions out in the present. Sometimes people like that. Sometimes women like that emotional roller coaster. But as a man, it doesn't really do us much good to do that. But feeling something, giving ourselves permission to feel it, but then being able to take that step back and determine the correct course of action, that is masculinity to me. That is what is supposed to make men great. The ability to do that, to take a step back and to act more logically and rationally. That is a masculine trait. And so I think that's something that we should be striving for to do, because acting, the feelings are not fact. And when we act just out of our feelings without thinking, that's how men get in a lot of trouble. And that's how men do a lot of stupid things too. They don't think. And I think even Tate said, or I forget who even said this, but like a lot of those school shooter type dudes, that's what they're doing. They're in their emotions and just raging. I mean, they've been taught, and they probably stuffed them for a while too, and they festered and festered, and they wrote about it in their diaries, etc., until one day, blew up. Boom. And that happened. And I'm actually going to look to, speaking of that, I do want to interview the mother of one of the Columbine shooters, because I think now she's become a huge mental health advocate, and because of what happened to her son. And I think she'd be a fascinating person to talk to. I think she has a very unique perspective on a lot of that stuff. And so I've had my thoughts on how to help teenage kids, especially teenage boys. They are tough to help. And I used to do mentoring where parents would hire me to help their kids. But it goes back to the thing I talked about at the very beginning. If someone doesn't want help, if someone doesn't want to do something different, if someone doesn't want to like kind of open up about what's really going on, there's really not much you can do for them. Like, they gotta need to help themselves. And that's always why I like what Rollo says about enlightened self-interest. We can best help others when we help ourselves first. So key. so key to be able to do that. So those kids, and let's face it, when you're a teenage kid, a lot of times you're a brick wall. It takes a certain kind of person for them to be willing to kind of like be open with. And it's got to be someone they like, think is like cool, and it can't be someone like associated with their parents or something like that. Like that's gonna make them shut down. But it's not easy. It's certainly not going to be easy. But I think a lot of kids should probably listen to Andrew because, yeah, granted, some things he says he exaggerates, but the principles of what he is saying, most of the time, I think they're true. One more thing. Last question. Thoughts on good times make weak men make hard times. In my opinion, we are in the latter part. We know history rhymes. Absolutely correct. History may not repeat itself, but it absolutely rhymes. And I think there's multiple things going on with that. So, like, say, the Great Depression era, the World War II era, like our grandparents, my grandparents' generation, they were called the greatest generation. And, like, what? Life wasn't too easy back then for them. You know, they went through a Great Depression. Then they had to go through a World War II. And, like, those are some big freaking stuff. Like, that's nothing to sneeze at. And takes a lot of courage, and I'm sure a lot of them went through all sorts of trauma and stuff. But the country was different. America was different back then. A way more moral country, way more religious country. There was community-wide morals and values, where there was a lot of guilt and shame. And I don't think all guilt and shame is bad. I think there's a lot of guilt and shame that can actually be good. And their generation, yeah, their generation, like they did that. And then today we would say, oh no, they were so judgmental. How could they ever do those things? But I think there was some wisdom in it. And I think it's careless of our generation to say, oh no, no, all the things they did must have been all wrong. Must have been. They could have. How could they be good? So there's also been studies where our grandparents' generation had more testosterone than our fathers, who had more testosterone than us. I think there's reasons for that. I try to counteract it with certain supplements, etc. But I think plastics are humongous, and our diets are humongous, and the kinds of things they put in the vegetables and the meats. I'm sure that has an effect too. But you can see it in dudes' faces today. Like you look at it, and their voices too. Look at dudes from the World War II generation. Look at their faces. Listen to how they talk, and they got a deeper voice. Their faces are hardened. They become more like complete and assertive. And then look at their kids, still fairly masculine, but look at the 60s, guys growing their hair longer, but they're still, more testosterone than our generation on average. And then you look at guys today, they got like very feminine faces, and they're just it's like soft looking. And you can tell there's nothing to them. Like they're missing something. And it's like, they're just like a male version of women, a lot of them, with male genitalia instead. So, and again, you touched on a good part there, like the weak men make hard times. That's where we are now. And I agree. And it's because it's men's fault, a lot of it, not all, but a lot of it is our fault for not putting our foot down. It's our fault for not saying to people and to women when they get a little crazy to say no. Like, we're not going to let this fly. We're not going to let the people who worked for Gillette, like, no, we're not going to let you do this toxic masculinity commercial. Like, no, like, we're not going to allow it. And I have other theories why corporations do all that stuff. Corporations often, they try to appease the woke mobs by doing nonsense like that. But it's really so that they don't have to do too much progressive policy financially. It's really so they cater to them to do that, but then they won't do the other stuff. But yeah, men need to stand up. And a big thing that I learned the other day, I read a quote about it. It said, never be afraid to tell the truth. Be concerned for the people that will be hurt and manipulated and scarred if you don't tell the truth. And I've been trying to live by that a lot recently because there's a lot of things going on in the world that annoy me. So I may not be anti-vax, for example, but I am certainly anti-mandates of any kind. And if you've seen what's happened in Canada recently with that trucker blockade, I guess we'll call it. I'm all for them doing that. All for them doing that because, like, I'm not afraid of a vaccine. That's what they'll say. Oh, you're just afraid of a vaccine. It's just a shot. It's just to help other people. Who cares? It's like, well, it's the principle of the matter because only principles will stand between us and some other BS down the line that we don't want to have happen. And they like so it's become a political issue. Democrats, progressives, they are very much more pro-vaccine. They might be okay with this mandate and letting people's jobs be tied to it, etc. But what they don't understand is, say, a Republicans in power again, maybe they want a different kind of mandate down the line. And so the principle here that is being established could be used against them later. We don't know. We do not know what kind of BS could be down the line. And so, like, a vaccine passport can be a thing, but I easily could see some sort of, instead of a vaccine passport, you have something like, oh, we have your name in this chip, and we're going to scan all of your social media stuff. And if you have certain opinions, yes or no, we're not going to let you do X, Y, or Z. Easily, those kinds of things could happen. And like the precedent originally for a vaccine, so Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who's a Supreme Court justice, and in 1927 he used the precedent from smallpox vaccines to say to sterilize women that were quote unquote feeble-minded against their will. And he said the precedent that was established with smallpox vaccines is wide enough to cover the cutting of the fallopian tubes. And he said 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So they used that precedent to start, what would you call that? Genetic stuff, genetic genocide type stuff. But I don't think it would happen that way today. But like Lewis said earlier, history may not repeat itself, but it rhymes. So we do not know what kind of BS could be down the line. And I don't want to see that part. My whole thought on that kind of thing was always, if you want to get vaccinated, go get vaccinated. That's it. Like, it should be everyone's choice what they should do. It should not be tied to your job. It should not be tied to where you can go. That was always my thoughts on the matter. And there's no reason to me to think for something that has a 99% plus survival rate, it doesn't make you paralyzed like smallpox or polio did, whatever it was the FDR had. I just don't see it. I thought it was just out of proportion. But let's see, last question here. I think we're heading into dark times. They are control. They're not giving it back. Thanks for saying softy. You got it, brother. No, I think you're right. Things since the social media era has come about around 2008, it's been a whole different life. Now, I'm 36 years old, born in 1985. I could very easily draw a line between my life pre-social media and then post-social media. Because this last, what is it, 14 years or so since smartphones came around, it's just a different world. And I thought about this today. The world that social media allowed was that we all became connected with one another. And we got access to information that you would have had to look up before. And we have instant access to all sorts of news. And it's like a mob. Like us on Twitter, on Facebook, and Instagram, it's the modern day equivalent of a mob. And it's not good. It's not good. It's making things tough. And what was mostly disappointing, and Tate touched on this too, is how little pushback people gave to what was going on, to having their business being shut against their will, and just kind of going along with it. People have kind of forgotten how to take a stand. People have forgotten how to say no. And to say, you know what, this is what I believe in, I'm going to like follow through with it. And there is some weird stuff. Like, thankfully, this Rona stuff's going to be over soon. It's going to be just the endemic, as they say. But there's some damage that's been done. And this is why that quote I said about telling the truth and not being afraid to tell the truth is key. Don't be afraid about the people that are going to criticize you for telling the truth. Worry about the ones that are going to be hurt because you don't. And maybe I was a little guilty before of not standing up for what I believe in louder before, because this stuff happens one small step at a time, as Mr. Peterson always says. And so, but we got to get them in the beginning of the steps so that before we get them in the beginning, it hasn't had a chance to snowball. It hasn't had a chance to accumulate. Because once it's snowballed and accumulated, as we see now, it's harder. It's harder to get underneath it. It's harder to get on top of it. So the second we see some BS going wrong, you got to pounce on it, because that's when it's the most vulnerable. You pounce on it in the beginning, because if you wait too long, think about it like the boring example, but think about it in Germany in World War II. Like, the time to pounce on the Nazi movement was in 1933, if not before that. Probably even the 20s. Like when he did the beer hall putsch. Like, you got to get that stuff before it gets big. But once it gets big, then it gets a lot harder to stop it. So, we've covered a lot today so far. We started with Miss Former USA there, and we've wound up here. So, yeah, I can't say I'm unhappy that we got here, though, because this is stuff that I enjoy talking about, too. But I guess to wrap things up here, unless there's any more questions, but it's, if you're feeling that kind of way, you got to find something that works for you. I don't care what it is. I don't care how you do it. But it is your responsibility to do it and to take care of it. And it's up to us. You got to think about all the things that, they got to have things to look forward to in our own lives. Think of the people that won't receive our gifts down the line. Anything you got to tell yourself to make it through the day would be big. And let's also face it, doing that is an emoting thing to do. That is us literally acting on our feelings. Now, mental illness is tough. It's hard. I get it. It's like, I always use the analogy of the glasses. It's when you're super depressed, you're seeing life through that dark lens. And it taints everything you see. And you got to get a way to get that tint gone, whether it's supplements or prescription meds or whatever it may be. That's what you got to do. But it's up to us to do it. We don't know what happens when we're gone. We might just become dirt. Maybe we get reincarnated. Nobody knows. Maybe there's a heaven. Maybe there's a hell. Nobody really knows. Now, there's some interesting stuff that people talk about, near-death experiences, etc. But I would like to think I want to live the most while I'm here. Like, 'cause I don't know what's next. Nobody does. So I wouldn't want to cut it short. And ultimately, people who do, it's like they have lost hope, and they've thought to themselves that it'll be better if they're gone. And they're no longer grateful for the things that are there. Because if they were, they wouldn't do it. And people may get mad about that, but that is truly what I believe. That it is just it's the giving up and the losing hope. But it doesn't have to get to that place. I choose to believe there will always be hope if we choose it. But we got to choose it. We got to look for it. It's not always going to be easy. And we can't always get stuck in our feelings about it either. Sometimes we got to do the right thing regardless of how we feel. And yes, it is going to be hard when we're feeling bad. 100%. But I've been talking for a little while here, so thank you very much to everyone who's been watching. Please like the video if you liked the video. And please don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. So thanks very much, everybody. Thanks, Lewis, for all your questions. You gave me some good stuff to bounce off of there. I really appreciate it. So thanks, everybody.